Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel and welcome to another video. Love to see you all again for another one. Of course, we're going to continue our Linux journey. In this particular video, we're going to learn all about shell redirection. Now, as a quick reminder, if you are not up to date as to what we're talking about in this particular series, go ahead and check out the description. There's links below so that way you can get updated up to the point that we are today. I will not lie to you, we've already started the journey and it's going to be a little bit tough to understand what we're talking about and what we're learning if you're not up to date as to where we are today. So as always, guys, go ahead and check out the description. There's always going to be links to catch you up to where we are. If you learned something from the video, make sure you give me a like for the video as it helps the channel grow. Go ahead and share the video with a family member or friend. And of course, subscribe to the channel while turning on the notification by hitting that bell. So that way you're aware whenever we upload new content to the channel. All right, guys, with housekeeping out of the way, let's learn about shell redirection. That's a fancy term, I guess. Let's figure out what that means. Hey everyone, welcome back to the desktop. And again, keep in mind that we're going to be building our skills from all the other concepts that we've learned in the past. So if you are not up to date with our playlist, go ahead and check the description below as you will find all the information needed in order to be up to date up until this point. With all the housekeeping items out of the way, let's jump into today's topic, which we're going to learn about shell redirection. Now make sure you watch this to the end because there's multiple things about shell redirections that we have to learn. So you want to get good at this because it's going to help you out tremendously in your career. So as always, the first thing that we do is let's open up our terminal, and you should already know how to open up a terminal by now. So let's head over to activities. Let's click on our terminal. Now, what is shell redirection? And I'll go ahead and put something up on the screen for you because this is going to be a mouthful. You all know how much I love definitions. So let's get into this one. So shell redirection is a process in which the input or the output of a command in a command line interface is directed to or from a file or command. And we do that using different symbols, and I'll show you what those symbols are, and we use it to manipulate data flow. Now, what the heck does all that mean? Let's break that down so we can better understand what that definition meant. So first things first, what is a process? Well, as simple, a process is an instance of a running program. So when we're on the terminal and let's say we do a PWD for print working directory, that right there was a process that was running, or some small program to do something for us. And in this case, the small program is, hey, telling us what's our working directory or print working directory. When you do an ls, and you're saying, hey, list the contents of the current directory that I'm in, that is a small process that runs and shows us what's available in our directory. And just as a tidbit, if you guys are interested in seeing what processes are currently running on your machine as a snapshot in time, you can use the ps command. As you see, the ps command shows you that you have two processes running. You have bash and you have ps, which we just ran. And the reason, of course, is because we have our bash shell up, and we also have the command, which we just ran. Now, here's another interesting thing when it comes to a process running on your machine. When you start a process starts with 3, and this is at least 3 file descriptors. So the next question is, what is a file descriptor? And again, we love definitions, so I'll go ahead and put that up on the screen for you. A file descriptor is an integer value that represents open files or IO streams. And IO streams are just input and output. So at a minimum, you have your first integer value of 0. That is what we call standard input, or the process is able to read from your keyboard. The next one, of course, and you might have guessed it, is 1, and that 1 stands for standard output, and this is what sends the output to our terminal. And then the third one, of course, and you guessed it because at least 3, remember, is number 2, and number 2 is for standard error, and this sends our standard error messages to the terminal. Now, all these definitions, yeah, it's great that we talk about them, but one of the things that I love doing, I like learning by drawing things out just to see it. So we'll go ahead and draw this out so we can all see how this all fits together. Personally, I'm not the greatest drawer, but we will attempt the drawing in order to make sure that everybody learns. Alright guys, so the first thing that we do is let's go ahead and draw our process. So PWD will be our process that is running, right? We ran it in the terminal. Alright, so at a minimum, we have our keyboard, and our keyboard is connected through standard input. And standard input has a integer value of 0. So then afterwards, you have 1 and 2, which we just discussed. And 1 and 2 are, so standard error, standard output. So here we have our terminal, and standard output and standard error both connect to our terminal. and standard output has an integer value of 1. Standard error has an integer value of 2. Now remember, this is just a minimum. So you can have more file descriptors, and these file descriptors can control the flow of data. Alright guys, so one of the interesting thing is, yeah, you can give definitions and we can talk about it, but I don't think that we can see the full power of what this actually means until we work some real examples in the terminal. So let's go ahead and draw our first example. So I'm going to go ahead and erase our PWD, and I'm going to go ahead and say that our process is going to be the ls command. And the difference now is that we're going to take our standard output, and what we're going to do is we're actually going to disconnect our standard output from the terminal. And what we're going to do is we're actually going to connect that to a file. So we are going to connect our standard output to a file. And we do that by using the greater than sign. So let's jump on our terminal and practice using the greater than sign in order to redirect our standard output to a file instead of the terminal. Let's see what that looks like. So on to our first example. Again, we talked about we're going to run the ls command, and that's going to be our process. But the difference now is that we're going to send or redirect the output, remember, which has an integer value of 1. We're going to redirect that to a file using the greater than sign. So if we just run ls by itself, so we got on the terminal our results from that ls command, and it's showing the contents of our current directory. Now let me show you what it looks like by using the greater than sign. So if we do ls greater than, and let's say we want to name the file ls output. The difference between our previous command and the command that we just ran is we no longer got an output to the terminal. The output went to a file. And if we do an ls again, we can see that here is the file that was just created by our previous command. And if we do a cat to show us the contents of the file, here is a list of all the directories that are within that particular folder. And we did that by using the ls command, except we redirected the output to a file instead of our terminal. How cool is that by using shell redirection? Now let's head back to our whiteboard to break this down just a little bit further so that we were all on the same page. Now keep in mind, on the keyboard we typed in the ls command, our standard output which has an integer value of 1, and let's go ahead and put that 1 in there. Our standard output which has a value of 1, which we just put in there, is the file. So we redirected the outputs of the ls to the file, and of course if we had any errors, standard error says put that on the terminal, as you see there, which our file descriptor has an integer value of 2. So continuing with the same example, there is another thing that we can do in order to control how we redirect our standard inputs and outputs. And one of the other things that I want to teach you guys is the difference between appending and the difference between overwriting. So overwrite and append, these are just fancy terms for saying that on the overwrite side, if there's a file that already exists, we're going to get rid of the contents that we have inside of it, and we're going to replace it with whatever the output is from our process. And in this case, as we're seeing here, the ls command. Now append is very different. Append says when ls sends the output to a file, if that file already exists, then we're not going to get rid of whatever's inside of that file. We're just going to keep adding to it. For overwriting, we just actually went over that, and it is the greater than sign. For appending to a file, we use 2 greater than symbols. So let's run through that example and see what it looks like in the terminal. To show you quickly, if we do a cat on ls output, we see all the directories in that file. Great. Let's go ahead and overwrite that file, but this time we're going to, instead of using the ls command, we'll use the pwd command for print working directory. And the output that we should see is that all the contents within the ls output file should disappear, and you should only see the contents of our latest process that we ran, which is the pwd command. So let's go ahead and try that out. Pwd greater than in order to do overwrite, and we are going to send it to the ls output file. So let's run that command. And now if I were to do a cat on the file, well, what do you know? The contents are completely gone. All the directories that we saw from before are no longer there. And the only thing that we have now is the output of pwd, which was our latest process, and it shows us our print working directory, or our current working directory. All right, great. So we just saw shell redirection, and we saw that with overwriting a file. Now let's go ahead and do the same thing, but let's go ahead and append to the file, meaning don't get rid of the stuff in the file, just add to the file if the file exists. Now, to show the difference between what was already in that file and some new output that we're going to put in that file, we're going to change the command, and let's go back to the ls command so you can see the difference between print working directory and the ls command, except this time, again, we're going to use two greater than symbols in order to append to the file, so that way I can keep both outputs there and not overwrite like we did on the last one. We're going to do ls greater than, and let's send it to ls output. Now let's cat the file and see what output we get. We have our first argument, which was our print working directory, and then we also have our ls command, which was all the directories, and this is what you're seeing here, that was appended to the file because we use two greater than symbols instead of overwriting the file. Let's head back to the whiteboard and let's take a look at another example. And this time, instead of sending our standard output to a file, I want to send our standard error, any error messages that we get, to a file. And we can change our standard output, instead of the file like we did in this case, we can send that back to our terminal. So again, let's jump into our whiteboard, draw it out so that way we can see it, and then we'll come back to our desktop and actually implement it. So standard out, we're going to send it to the terminal. And again, remember, standard out is with the file descriptor of 1. And standard error is going to be sent to a file. And again, it has a file descriptor of 2. Let's go ahead and actually run an example to see how that works. So let's take a look at what's inside our directory with an ls command. Now let's say I'm interested in searching for a file that doesn't exist. What if we were to look for Lewis output 2? We should get an error saying that this file or directory doesn't exist. And that is what I mean by the errors that you get within a process. Instead of sending them to our terminal, we can send that to a file. So let's do ls, and we're looking for ls output 2, which of course we know doesn't exist. And what we can do is we can take our standard error, which remember has a file descriptor of 2, and we can redirect that to a file now. And so let's name that file. The name of the file can be ls errors. Let's run that command and see what we get. So if we do an ls again, we can see that we have the file now called ls errors, or ls underscore errors. So let's go ahead and cat that file and see what we get. The error that we got from the ls command, or the process that we were running, had an error, but this time, instead of redirecting it to the terminal like we normally do by not using shell redirection, in this case, we use shell redirection by using the greater than sign, but we send that error message to a file. Now, if I didn't do the shell redirection, and let's go back to our previous command, and I just said, hey, I'm looking for ls output 2, and if I run that, I didn't do shell redirection in this case, so therefore, I got that message directly on my terminal instead of the file. Now, interestingly enough, you can overwrite or you can append to the file. It's up to you, and the same concepts that we learned before applies over here. So let's try that. We have our previous command. Let's say I'm looking for ls underscore output 3. We're going to take our standard error, and we're going to send that over to ls error. As you saw previously, ls underscore errors, that already has content inside the file, and it was the content of, hey, the error from our last ls, which was looking for the file ls underscore output 2. In this case, we are overwriting the file because we are only using one greater than symbol. So let's see how that works. So if I cat the ls underscore errors, we can see that we only have one message, and it's looking for the file which doesn't exist, and we knew that of course, which is ls underscore output 3. Now let's go ahead and do an append now so we can see the difference. So here's our previous command, and let's change our ls underscore output 3 to an ls underscore output 4. Except this time, instead of the one greater than symbol, we're going to use two greater than symbols, meaning that we don't want to erase the contents of the file, we just want to keep adding to it. So let's run that command and see what we get. So now let's go ahead and cat our ls underscore errors, and we see that we've appended to the file, meaning we're adding to it. You see it couldn't find our ls underscore output 3 from our original command, and then also we've appended to the file, and we can't find now ls underscore output 4. So really cool ways in how you can use shell redirection in order to send things to a file, and it can be either standard error, it can be standard output. You choose how you want to redirect the data of that process or the running program. Hey guys, quick pause. Hopefully you're enjoying the content. If you are enjoying the content and you find that it provides value, make sure you go ahead and subscribe to the channel and turn on your notifications so you don't miss out when we upload to the channel. Make sure to give me a like for the video as it helps the channel grow. Share the video with a family member or friend so that way they can learn all about engineering, tech, and finances. Also, leave me a comment. Do you guys have any questions on what you learned so far? I would love to hear from you. So let's head back to the content. Now moving on to our next example, and of course if you made it this far it should be very easy, is taking our standard error and instead of putting it towards a file, how do we, let's say, put it in the trash? Let's draw that on the whiteboard real quick. So in this particular case, we're still going to have our standard output going to the terminal. So this time we're going to send it to the trash, and that was my attempt at a trash can. So let's go ahead and run this example on our terminal. So again, we have our previous command of we're searching for a file called ls_output4, and we know that doesn't exist. So let's go ahead and erase this up until the point that we get to our standard error, which was file descriptor number 2. And we're going to redirect the output of file descriptor number 2, which again is our standard error. We're going to send that to dev null. So this command is basically saying, hey, send standard error out to trash. When I run this command, of course the file doesn't exist and we are going to get an error, but we're not going to see that error because we sent it to the trash. So let's go ahead and run the command. And as you just seen, our command didn't output anything because we sent the output, which was standard error, to our trash can. In this case, our trash can is called /dev/null. Now let's head back to the whiteboard to take a look at another example of shell redirection. Now let's go ahead and send our standard output to a file. And then also let's send our standard error, any errors that we have, also to the file. And we can make that connection there. And of course it has a file descriptor of 2. So in this case, you're sending both the standard output and the standard error to a file, 1 and 2. Now let's head back to the terminal and actually see how this works. So I'm going to work with our previous command in order to show you this example. Let's go ahead and do an ls for ls output. And we know that that file exists because it's sitting right over here. And what we're going to do in this case is we are going to redirect our standard output and also as well our standard error from our ls process to a file. So now we get to the point where we do redirection, and again I'm going to append because I don't want to overwrite the file, but I'm going to append, and there's a reason why, because I want to show you two different commands, of course, one with the file that exists and one with the file that doesn't exist. In this case the file exists, so let's use the append, and we can name our file std error _std out. And the next part is making sure that we direct both our standard error and our standard output. And we do that by doing standard error, which is our file descriptor number 2, is greater than ampersand, which means and, 1, which is our file descriptor for our standard output. Let's run that command and see what we get. So if we do an ls, we now have the file std error _std out. Let's go ahead and cat that and see the contents of that file. And we see that we have the results from our ls command, and of course it found the file because it existed. Now let's run the previous command that we just did, except this time let's change the ls_output to an ls_output4. The reason why we do that is because we know that the file doesn't exist, so it will produce an error, but we are redirecting the error to our file, and that is done of course with this portion of our command, right? Remember, we're sending not only our output, but we're sending our standard error to our file, and we are appending to the file called std error _std out. Now this is why it was important to use the append, because we want to not overwrite the file, we want to append to it so that way we see all the results in one file. So let's run that command. Now let's go ahead and cat our file, and there we go. We have the results from trying to find ls_output, which it did, and then we also have the results, which is can't find our ls_output4. So we saw an example of how standard error and standard output was sent to a single file using one command. Now keep in mind, we use the append example. You can also change that to overwrite, which is just 1 greater than, and that'll be an example for you to run. Hey guys, welcome back. So you learned quite a number of things when it comes to shell redirection. Some of the things that I want you guys to practice over and over again. And remember, you want to keep practicing because at first it seems like it's difficult, but over time it's going to turn very, very easy. So practice makes perfect. But just to reiterate on some of those things are the differences between overwriting and appending a file. That took me a little bit to get, when I first started. Learning what standard error is, what is standard output, what is standard input, what's a process, right? These are all these little terms that people throw out at you. And it's not until when you see it in the whiteboard where you realize, oh, it's really easy. It's just people like to put a lot of like technical stuff on it. And remember, when you get into those positions in your career, they're going to be using all this technical jargon. So it's really cool to be able to get this information now. So when you get there, you know exactly what people are talking about. Also, always check the description, as we're always updating it with new things. And might I add, our team is working on an environment for you guys to go ahead and practice your skills. So that's why I always say in my videos, go ahead and check out the description, because you always want to stay up to date with all the latest and greatest. So that'll do it for this video, guys. Make sure you go ahead and subscribe to the channel, turn on the notifications as we talked about earlier. Go ahead and give me a like for the video if you love the content. Remember, it helps the channel grow, and we want to teach everybody about engineering and tech, and of course, finances. And don't forget to share the video with a family member or friend so we can kick off their engineering or technology career. Or maybe if they're in it already, we can refine a couple of things. So I'll see you guys in the next one.